Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, March 5, 2024. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, for all you're doing for the Washington Brief, and welcome everybody. Today's program is Kim Jong-un preparing for war? Our moderator today is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, who's been a commentator for years on security issue. Formerly, Ambassador DeTrani was special envoy for the six-party talks with North Korea, the director of National Counter-Proliferation Center, and the associate director of national intelligence. Dr. Alexandre Mansourov will give commentary. Dr. Mansourov is an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is also an adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins and the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. We are honored to present today our guest panelist, Mr. Robert Manning, who's a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and its Reimaging Grand Strategy Program and its Global Foresight Hub. He's author of several books, including the Global Innovation Sweepstakes, The Quest to Win the Future, also Envisioning 2030, Can the U.S. Keep Its Innovative Edge, and the Future of Extended Deterrence in Asia to 2025 and other studies. He has served as a senior strategist at the Director of National Intelligence and National Counterproliferation Center. And previous to that, he was director of the Long Range Energy and Regional Global Affairs of the U.S. National Intelligence Council's Strategic Futures Group. In addition, he held numerous roles in planning and policy development for energy technologies, climate change issues, and others. He has been a prolific in publishing or editing essays, especially on Asia's security issues, China, Korea, Japan, regional security. He was previously the advisor for policy and public diplomacy to the Assistant Secretary of State of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State. So we're honored to present Mr. Robert Manning, and our moderator, Ambassador DeTrani. It's all yours. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Michael. And it's great having Bob Manning with us today. There's so much to discuss. I mean, literally, the world is in disarray when you look at the geopolitical situation out there. The recent death and the funeral of Alexei Navalny made it very clear what's going on in the Russian Federation. Also, the war in Ukraine continues into its third year with significant casualties, civilian casualties over 30,000, military casualties over 30,000, Russian troops who have been killed in this conflict, in this war, over 300,000, significant. What's happening in Gaza with Israel's war against the Hamas terrorist group, so tragic. Over 30,000 Palestinians dead. Starvation, the potential for starvation, very, very significant what's going on there. Now, prospects for peace hopefully are within reach, but still, it's a distance. North Korea, this is a subject we're talking about today. What's going on in North Korea? Kim Jong-un is continuing to make additional nuclear weapons, has shown with his demonstrations of intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities. The most recent launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong-18, with a reach of over 15,000 kilometers, solid fuel, road mobile. His embrace of Vladimir Putin and his support to Russia's war in Ukraine with artillery shells, ballistic missiles. This goes on and on. We could talk, no one's talking about Myanmar entering its fourth year of the military coup. Significant casualties, civilians killed. What's happening in Burma is very tragic. The situation in Burma and Myanmar, very, very tragic. Obviously, Iran. We can go down a whole list. But today we're focusing on North Korea. A recent publication came out and spoke about the potential for conflict, not only conflict, but the potential for Kim Jong-un inciting a nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula, the prospects of war. So we're talking about all these issues today, and we have Bob Manning, who is really very qualified. I've worked with this man, very qualified to talk about these things and to unpack some of these issues. So, Dr. Manning, over to you. I think we'll have a very interesting discussion.
Thank you. And Joe, I'm glad you outlined the international context, because I think you can't understand what's going on in North Korea outside this contrast. Is what sometimes we call a polycrisis of a disorderly world, where all these events and crises are cascading off each other. And I think that makes it much worse. Let me give you my bottom line up front and then explain it. I think you're referring to the article that Bob Carlin and Sig Hecker wrote and asked this question. My conclusion is probably not, but I do agree that we're probably in the most dangerous situation in the Korean Peninsula since 1950. And why do I say that? Partly, if you think about since 1990 through the six-party talks and the February Leap Day Agreement in 2012, the context has changed. We didn't have the end of the Cold War created a more conducive climate for dealing with North Korea, and I think we saw several agreements, all of which collapsed under their own weight, the agreed framework and the six-party talks. But what happened is, I think the current events really go back to the Hanoi summit in 2019, and I think Kim felt humiliated when that fell apart. There was no attempt at diplomacy. It was a deal on the table. It was rejected. Trump walked out, even as his own negotiators were trying to figure out if there was a compromise that could be moved to. And since that time, there have been two seminal developments. I think one is that Kim, since really for three generations of Kims, going back to his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, North Korea has sought to normalize relations with the United States. And I think that the episode with the Hanoi summit really is one seminal shift to where he has no interest in the United States anymore. And we saw over the last 5 years an acceleration of his weapons of mass destruction, the missiles, the several, long-range missiles, tactical nukes, an accelerated effort to create, at a minimum, a survivable second strike capability. But also, the way he talks about tactical nukes, and here the Ukraine experience enters as a factor. Putin's threat, what we're seeing is the unraveling of the entire arms control architecture from the Cold War has, I think, we run the risk of lowering the threshold for nuclear use. Kim Jong-un has listened carefully to Vladimir Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons. And I think there's something you can't dismiss. So that was one. And the second element really is really remarkable to me. In the January 15th speech, Kim walked away from the whole notion of a divided Korea. In other words, since his grandfather, the notion of a divided Korean family that had to be brought together again was a major element in Korean policy. And we saw North-South summits and so on, going back from the Kim Jong-un period at the beginning of this century to the Moon administration. Suddenly, he announced that South Korea is it's no longer part of a family. It's just it's an enemy state. And I think that the propaganda of all these generations in North Korea have been about unification. It's been it had been a sort of a source of legitimacy for them. And suddenly he just blew that up. So that's why I say we're in a dangerous situation. And what abolishing the whole notion of reunification create, and I think this wouldn't be happening if you hadn't had, I think what's probably best called the Eurasian Entente, and that is you have a still transactional coalition of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. And I think this is one of the reasons he's shifted from normalization with the U.S. to aligning himself with Russia and China. And I can tell you the Chinese are not thrilled about this either, because up until recently, China was providing 90% of the trade, the food, the fuel that kept North Korea going. Suddenly you have a Russian alternative. And I think the Kim's trip to Vladivostok, not an accident. He went to the satellite facility because I think the bargain that was made was getting help. Kim had two unsuccessful satellite launches last year, and the third after his trip was successful. I think we all have a sense, we can't prove it, but that they had Russian help. And so in exchange for that, he's also providing weapons to Russia to fight in Ukraine, which also seems to me a sign that he's not preparing for war, because you wouldn't be sending hundreds of containers of weapons to Russia. And certainly you would be putting troops on the border if you were preparing for war. So that, I think that gives us the context. And this new partnership with Russia, reduces China's influence. And, whatever you can say about Chinese policy, the number one concern of China for decades has been stability on the peninsula. And I think the Chinese see Putin more as a disruptor. And I think one reason that the North Koreans have not conducted the seventh nuclear test, which people have been speculating about for the last couple of years, is because it was a Chinese red line. And you have to wonder if Putin has the same red line, or if all he cares about is making things more difficult for the United States. He may be more tolerant of North Korean belligerence than China. So that's another thing we have to worry about. And at the same time, you have to start thinking about the provocations from North Korea and what this new situation with all their new developed weapons could lead to. Remember the attack of the Cheonan in the Korean waters, the attack on Yongbyon Island. And one interesting point to worry about is the North Koreans have rejected the UN maritime border between North and South Korea. So that sort of lays the basis for potential provocations. And the last thing I would worry about, again, the Ukraine comes into play, and also Taiwan. If you think about one thing we do have to worry about is if the U.S. got involved in a war with China over Taiwan, I think the North Koreans would be very tempted to attack the South, assuming that, and again, the risk here is miscalculation. That's I think the essence of the new danger that we're facing. I think North Korea would be tempted to to make a move on South Korea. And so and what do we do about this? I think the administration has done a very good job in terms of building a trilateral alliance with South Korea and Japan. One of the dangers we face now is this security dilemma behavior, right? In the sense that the U.S. is doing everything it can to reassure South Korea of our nuclear deterrent. We've sent B-1s and B-52s along the border. We've sent Trident nuclear submarines to reassure them of our nuclear commitment, and then you have North Korea reacting to that, making threats and so on, firing off, using that as a justification for more missile tests. And so the question is, can we break this cycle? And do we have to respond to every North Korean threat, or is there? And I think the other thing you have to worry about is, I think, in a sense, Kim may be waiting for Trump. In the sense that I think, Trump considers himself a deal maker above all. And I think he would, he still brags in his campaign speeches about his relationship with Kim. And I think he would be tempted to try again. And so I don't think there's much potential for it, but I think we could get dragged into a not defensible deal with Kim, not for total nuclear disarmament, because Kim has taken that off the table with everything he's done, but an attempt to try to a nuclear freeze or something like that, which in theory is not a bad idea. But the failure of all the other deals with North Korea, as Joe knows very well, all revolved around the lack of transparency. If we can't verify how many nukes they have, how do we know if they're frozen, for example? They've never declared what their nuclear program is. So I think we may try, but I think it's a very problematic situation. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob. That was outstanding. A lot to unpack. Alexander, please.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Ambassador, for giving me the floor. And Bob, excellent presentation. So let me begin by clarifying a couple of points, then kind of outlining my position, and then asking a question. The first point I'd like to clarify is what actually Ambassador DeTrani said, that in the two years of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, you said that Russia killed 30,000 Ukrainians. And at the same time, you said that in 4 months of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel killed almost 30,000 Palestinians. So, I have big doubts about these numbers, but if you believe the official story from the other side, more than 444,000 Ukrainians were killed or wounded in that conflict already, not 30,000. It's tragic. On the other hand, almost 160,000 Russians were killed or wounded in that conflict. So over 500,000 on both sides. Again, it's a different dimension, if you wish. It's a different magnitude of conflict than what we see happening in Gaza. Again, it's a tragedy, and it's a very sad story, which has implications for the entire world. We have to be careful with numbers, because if we turn to the Korean Peninsula and what's being discussed, that Russian-North Korean connection and the alleged instances of North Korean shipments of ammunition and shells to Russia. Again, the numbers thrown out there, 1 million shells, 3 million shells. But the reality is very different. First of all, there's very little evidence other than some imagery, which again can be interpreted in different ways. And so unless you have some human sources, it's hard to really ascertain facts. But remember, one artillery shell, 155 millimeter, costs about $1,000. So if you say North Korea supplied Russia 1 million shells, it's $1 billion aid package. If it's 3 million shells, it's a $3 billion aid package. For a country the size of North Korea with a GDP of $24 billion, I mean, are we really thinking that that's the type of military aid that North Korea is delivering to Russia, let alone the fact that last year the entire European Union was able to produce and deliver only 300,000 shells to Ukraine. Now, that said, whatever North Koreans supplied or didn't supply Russia, clearly it's inconsequential. It's inconsequential for the war in Ukraine, where just in 1 year, Russia spent almost 17 million artillery shells. Again, a huge amount, tragic, nevertheless. So that's a couple of points of clarification to put it all in perspective. Now, on the substantive issue, whether North Korea is preparing for war or not, I believe, yes, of course it is. Why? Because every country's military prepares for war. There is no surprise here. We do it, South Koreans do it, North Koreans do it. The Korean Peninsula basically has witnessed since the 1950s, since the end of the Korean War, constant preparations for the new conflict, and yet there was no war thanks to the deterrence, which is working and has been working for the past 70 years. That said, absolutely, North Korean conventional capabilities are growing, its nuclear and missile capabilities are growing. There is no question about it, but the types of indicators we would expect to see on the eve of a North Korean attack, simply we have not observed them. So you can't really talk about it. And by the way, when North Koreans do make threats, whether to blow up the balloon launching stations or South Korean conservative media for anti-North Korean messaging, they never, came through with those threats. If anything, when North Koreans sank the Cheonan warship or shelled the Yeonpyeon Island, they never signaled. They never signaled the intent to deliver those attacks in advance. Now, Bob said that this is the most dangerous time since the 1950s. And, I'll be honest with you, I disagree. And the reason for that is, actually, he mentioned the first reason is, if you're preparing for war, if it's a dangerous time, then you would not be shipping away, millions of artillery shells far away from the peninsula to arm a foreign country. Again, I dispute that fact, but logically, it doesn't make sense, number one. Number two, we know North Korea is opening up its borders. I mean, it's inviting foreign embassies to come back. That's not what you've been doing if you're preparing for war. Number three, increasingly, the leadership is focused on economic restructuring. Not only, they have announced major plans to restructure rural industries and basically jumpstart foreign trade, pivoting to the new partners in the north. This, again, something you would not be doing if you are preparing for war. Now, that said, let me ask one question, and then if we have time, and Ambassador, if you permit, then I'll have another question for Bob. Specifically, my question is about January 15th announcement, and that is Kim Jong-un's decision to abandon the 7-decade-old unification line. Now, some people interpreted it as a prelude to war on the peninsula, essentially saying that now Kim Jong-un is making South Korea as a legitimate target for the use of nuclear weapons, North Koreans. But others suggested that maybe this is actually a move towards disengaging from the South towards a more peaceful kind of coexistence between the two countries. How come, you would ask me? And my answer would be, remember, for 7 decades, we've been afraid of North Korean unification line. Why? Because it meant communization of the South, exporting the revolution across the DMZ and unifying under one red North Korean flag. Now they're saying we're no more interested in that. We want to be left alone. We are pivoting to the North. We want to basically mind our own business. And the reality is, it's worrisome because it may be aimed at delegitimizing South Korean unification campaign, South Korean unification plans, essentially putting them in the basket of imperialist land grab designs. If anything, to me, it resembles what the Ukrainians are telling the Russians. We're not interested in unification with Russia. We're no longer see each other as one people, as one country. Just leave us alone. We want to go different direction. We want to go, to the West, to Europe. So just like Russia, in my opinion, South Korea might be having trouble in knowing where South Korea ends and where North Korea or a foreign country begins, because they still are lingering, clinging to that notion of one people, one country, which clearly, people across the DMZ, or at least the regime there, at least the leadership there, and the official propaganda tell us they don't want to have. So that is my question. And for you, Bob, again, could you kind of zeroing in on this unification discourse and highlight for us your thinking, how you see that happening? Is it impactful? Is it consequential? Or is it just rhetoric? And if a liberal administration comes back to the Blue House in Seoul, then we might see North Koreans change their mind again.
Alexander, do you have a second question for Bob?
Yes, and the second question is about normalization. You mentioned that Kim Jong-un has given up on the idea of normalization of relations with the United States. And I just like to clarify it because at the end of your comments, you seem to be kind of willing to entertain the idea that if President Trump is elected, that Kim Jong-un might be kind of open to re-engaging with the United States. So he might be, in a way, repositioning himself for a different type of relationship with the United States under President Trump, along the lines of negotiating some arms control agreements, etc. So again, where exactly do you stand? Have they given up on the idea of normalizing relations with the U.S., or is it only concerning the Biden administration? They don't want to talk to the Biden people, and yet they're open to re-engaging a different administration, especially if President Trump is elected.
Over to you, Bob.
Okay, thank you. I think the short answer to both your questions is we don't really know. One point I want to make, you talked about why they're not preparing for war. I don't think we disagree as much as it might sound, because I draw a distinction between planning and preparation. And of course, as you said, that's what militaries do. They plan for wars. That's their job. But preparing for war is a different matter. And for all the reasons we both indicated, they're supplying Russia, the fact that they're not strengthening troop levels along the border and so on, suggests that that's not any imminent preparation. But I do think it's dangerous, and there is a miscalculation can take you there by default. On South Korea, if you look at his January 15th speech, the language is very belligerent. It's not we want to have détente with South Korea. It's they're an enemy, and we may, if the circumstances arise, we may want to conquer them. So I'm not. Yes, it's possible as things evolve that it could become a peaceful divide, but I don't see where that the trend's going in that direction. On the question of normalization, I think the reason I raise that is I think one long time goal of North Korea is to legitimize their nuclear program. In other words, they want to be like Israel and Pakistan. If you talk to in my previous over time discussions with North Koreans, they always raise that. They prefer Pakistan to Israel, but that's the analogy they use. And so if Kim could get that and get sanctions dropped, I think he would be tempted. And that's why I suggest that one way to do that is to have some kind of arms control framework, which would, of course, is like a nuclear freeze, which have been talked about for many years. So I think it's possible. I don't think it would work, but I think it's possible. And I suspect that Trump would be tempted. And so there might, and I think it's possible that they would try. There would be some back and forth that might lead to another summit. But I don't see it working. And I think he's not interested in normalization in the sense of the way we've in the past considered it. That we'd be a normal country. We would give all these goodies to North Korea in exchange for them giving up their nuclear weapons. I mean, there's a reason he has never tried to do the kind of economic reforms that China and Vietnam have done. It's about total control and a terrorist state that he runs. So in that sense, I don't see much potential there, but I don't think you can rule it out. I also think the new Eurasian Entente makes him more comfortable going in that direction than in the other direction, and because the nuclear deal also assumed reconciliation with South Korea. Now that's off the table, so it's a very different approach that he's articulating.
Okay, Bob. Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the questions, Alexander. Let me make one or two comments and then ask a question, Bob. On the whole question of reunification, my interpretation is that Kim Jong-un made it very clear he's not interested in working with the Republic of Korea for a peaceful reunification. I don't think he's walked away from reunification. I think he still strives for reunification on his terms. And we saw that with the Korean War in 1950, right? On his terms. So I think that's fair, but I agree with Bob's comments about the enemy state. He's talking about South Korea now as being the enemy. And he's making it very clear. So I think it's that element of determination, of belligerence, if you will, towards South Korea is not only palpable, it's obvious. But I think reunification is still on his if you will, plans for the future, but on his terms and how he will do it. On the whole question of normalization with the United States, look, this is what since 1994 in the agreed framework, this is what North Korea has been pursuing, a normal relationship with the United States. And as Bob indicated, it fell apart in Hanoi after a very successful summit in Singapore the year before, in 2018. Regardless of what the critics say, I thought there was success in Singapore. But there was also success with the agreed framework and with the joint statement of September 19, 2005, with the six-party talks. And that spoke to an intent to be accepted by the United States and the international community as a legitimate nation state, not as a pariah state, and the benefits that would accrue, and especially with Kim Jong-un coming in 2011 after his father passed away, there was hope there. And you mentioned very briefly the Leap Day Agreement of 2012, and there was hope there. So I think there's still that prospect there, that Kim Jong-un has not walked away from a normal relationship with the United States and the international community. Unfortunately, now he's embraced Vladimir Putin. And he's not only been a supporter of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but now he's providing artillery shells, ballistic missiles to Russia. So I think that has made it very, very difficult for North Korea to sort of pivot back to a more normal relationship with the international community of the United States. However, I think that's still there. I don't think we should walk away from that. And I agree with your comments about arms control. North Korea has always said very clearly in negotiations with them that they want to be accepted as a nuclear weapon state, and their nuclear weapons are for deterrence purposes only. But now Kim Jong-un has made it very clear, it's with his preemptive use of nuclear weapons, with first use of nuclear weapons, it's not just for deterrence purposes. So he's changed the calculus significantly. And that's what we have to deal with. We have to deal with the North Korea of today, where it is, its relationship with the Russian Federation, its support to the war in Ukraine, its indication that South Korea is the enemy state, and walking away from peaceful reunification with the republic with South Korea. But everything else is on the table. And now talking about building his nuclear capabilities, his nuclear, that makes North Korea more of a threat. There's no question to the Republic of Korea, to the Korean Peninsula, but to the region and instability. And as Bob indicated, and I agree with that, that's not in China's interest. China, and I think China did put a red line down about a seventh nuclear test. So China is a player here. And China still is the lifeline, the economic lifeline for North Korea. Russia could never replace China as the economic lifeline for North Korea. There's no way. There's no way they can do that. They can help them with their nuclear weapons program, with their missile programs, as we saw with the satellite launch, the successful satellite launch. But so the U.S. is still very much involved there. And I think the prospects of re-engaging with North Korea should not be dismissed. We should continue to pursue them. And to pursue the element of making it clear, because there are 23 plus million people living in North Korea who are suffering. And we're talking about the potential for food scarcity again, and the potential for starvation. That's hard to believe when North Korea has built up a nuclear arsenal and missiles to deliver those nuclear weapons the way they have, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, submarine launch ballistic missiles, etc. And still we're talking about a dearth of food for the people in North Korea. That's wrong. And we're talking about the gulags that are going on in North Korea. That's wrong. And those political prison camps in North Korea. That's wrong. So there's an imperative here to work the North Korean issue. And I think, unfortunately, and this is my question to you, Bob, I think that's come off the radar. We hear there's so much bandwidth, and we can only deal with the Israeli war against the Hamas terrorist group in Gaza, after they, on the 7th of October, killed over 1,200 Israelis, women, children, elderly. How tragic. Take 253 hostages. How tragic that is. And the response now we see going on and the hunger going on. So yes, we need to be very much involved in that and involved with the war in Ukraine. But North Korea has to be considered. It has to be part of the approach. So although North Korea now, there's no indication that North Korea will ever dismantle their nuclear weapons, and I agree with that. There's no question. That doesn't mean we can't still down the road strive for that. Put that on our table in negotiations, knowing that we may never get there, but maybe a decade, maybe 2 decades. But as you said, a freeze, no more ballistic missile launches, no more nuclear tests, no more production of fissile material for nuclear weapons. That would be progress. So why not pursue that? So my question to you, Bob, is, are we doing everything necessary to keep North Korea within the realm of possibilities, with the objective of bringing them back into the fold, in the sense of moving them away from the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and the war in Ukraine, and bringing them more towards a peaceful reunification, not one of using tactical nuclear weapons or even conventional nuclear weapons, but bringing them back into the fold. Have we walked away from that? And if we haven't walked away from that, are we doing enough to re-engage with North Korea to get them to realize Kim Jong-un is on the wrong path?
Well, you raised a lot of questions. First, let me try to walk back through some of your comments. I agree with what you said about their attitude toward the South. I think, if you think back, the North Korean position has always been, we are the true Koreans. The South are puppets of imperialism, and so the idea that he could impose North Korea's communistic system on all of Korea is always a temptation. He just doesn't accept the legitimacy of South Korea as an entity to be negotiated with. So that's one. But I think the biggest issue that worries me is the geopolitical bifurcation that North Korea has made its bet with this Sino-Russian effort to delegitimize the U.S. led world order and try to create an alternative. And so in the past, I think he saw normalization and North-South dialogue as legitimizing factors. Now I think if you look at the scope of his missile and nuclear program, this has become the major source of legitimacy. So he has to keep reinforcing it. And as you rightly pointed out, one of the sources of worry is he's abandoned second strike and developing the weapons for, indeed, a first strike, particularly tactical nuclear weapons. And so that's worrisome. And so if I'm right that these new alignments are shifting his interest in the U.S., should we make it clear, as the Biden administration has, we're happy to talk anytime, no conditions? I think that should be the U.S. position. But I think that Kim has decided that the U.S. does not see him as a legitimate player, and that he thinks somehow the U.S. is focused ultimately on regime change, and therefore he's much less interested. That could change. I think you're right. You don't know if circumstances change. What happens in Ukraine? What happens post Vladimir Putin? In terms of where Russia is in the world, there's a lot of factors that could change that. But I right now, I don't see much potential for that. And I agree with you. The U.S. ought to make it very clear that we're open to discussing these things. And I think the administration has been doing that. But I just don't think. I think the levels of distrust are so profound on both sides that it's going to be very, very difficult.
Thank you, Bob. Alexander.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. And I was thinking that for strategic communication purposes, of course, we are good and they're bad, and we always do the right thing, and they always kind of advocate for the evil side. But the reality is, I mean, we need to at least, when we look at the mirror, we have sometimes to tell ourselves the truth. And the truth is, it was the Republic of Korea's government under Park Geun-hye leadership that shut down the Kim project. It was the Republic of Korea government under Lee Myung-bak's presidency which shut down the Kaesong Industrial Zone project. It was the Republic of Korea leadership under the Yoon administration which pulled out from the comprehensive military agreement. And so no wonder that, 15 years later, Kim Jong-un decided that, there is no partner in Seoul for any joint Korean projects. At the same time, we know whether, of course, we love it that the Republic of Korea supported our sanctions against Russia, pulled out its capital, shut down its trade with Russia, and by the way, shipped almost 500,000 artillery shells to Ukraine, by way of Poland. And then, of course, we're wondering why Russia all of a sudden changed its policy towards South Korea and decided finally, after many 30 years of neglect, actually, to rediscover a partner in the North. Although, again, some people still suggest that President Putin is imitating, that new engagement with Pyongyang more than anything else. So when, Bob, you talk about unraveling of the security architecture on the peninsula, worldwide, the arms control architecture, again, we really have to sometimes look at the mirror and be realistic about, who actually pulled out from the START II treaty or the Open Skies treaty or, IMF treaty, and who reacted to that. And you know what I'm talking about here. But my question is actually about the Biden administration's policy towards North Korea, because you suggested that, it's been doing it, and I quote you here, a very good job in strengthening the trilateral alliance. But really, has it done anything at all to kind of alleviate the challenge we're facing from Pyongyang? Because my worry is that this administration may have dropped the ball in its North Korea policy, not only because Pyongyang keeps accelerating its strategic weapons development, basically it's showing the middle finger to the United States, issuing nuclear threats to Washington, but we don't even have a national intelligence officer for North Korea anymore. Our Assistant Secretary of State for Asia Pacific is traveling in Papua New Guinea and New Zealand and other places instead of dealing with North Korea challenges. Has the Biden administration really given up on North Korea? I know the rhetoric. I mean, we're open to talks anytime, anywhere, under no conditions. But the reality is, it seems to me that nothing is being done, and they've pretty much given up on this issue, at least until elections. Would you agree to that, or do you have a different opinion?
No, I don't disagree. Look, I guess the question I would add, you can make the argument that strengthening deterrence should provide an incentive for North Korea to talk to us. I think that, and if you're sitting in Washington and ask yourself, well, Joe and I both worked in the six-party talks, and I can't even imagine that happening now. If you recall, in the sixth nuclear test, both Russia and China supported sanctions. And for a while, China was actually enforcing a lot of them. I can't imagine if there was a seventh nuclear test, they would both Russia and China would blame the United States and veto a UN resolution for more sanctions. So the strategic climate really and U.S. leverage with it, as Joe probably remembers, during the six-party talks, both Russia and China were very cooperative. They're very serious about it, and I can't. It's hard for me to imagine that in another round of talks. I also think there is a bandwidth question, which Joe mentioned. I think the administration is in a terrible situation. We have two open-ended wars that we're fighting vicariously, and Biden sometimes looks almost like a helpless bystander on both of them. And so it's really hard, it seems to me. I mean, to try to deal with both of these, and both Ukraine and Gaza still have a risk of escalation. So it's hard for me to see a lot of initiative being put into trying to persuade North Korea to reopen a dialogue on normalization or nuclear weapons. So in that sense, you're right. I think they've kind of given up. I think it with their position is more of a placeholder. If North Korea wants to talk, I think there would be talks, but they're not going to develop some elaborate strategy to try to lure North Korea into talks. I don't see that.
So Bob, a good question from Alexander, and I like your answer to that, Bob. I don't disagree with that. But you mentioned the six-party talks, and China played a very key role in the six-party talks, as we all know. And the current foreign minister, Wang Yi, was the principal, if you will, during the six-party talks, given that China convened the talks and the talks were in Beijing. And indeed, it was President George W. Bush who reached out to Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao, but certainly Jiang Zemin to get the six-party talks going, and then Colin Powell with his counterpart in Beijing. So China was very instrumental, because I think, as you said earlier, it's in China's interest to see stability on the Korean Peninsula. It's in China's interest to see stability in the region. It's in China's interest to see North Korea denuclearized completely and verifiably. So we have a common objective here. And as you also indicated, Russia was a player in the six-party talks and was very supportive. And Russia and China were supportive of the sanctions, certainly imposed in 2016. And those were the sanctions in 2017 that were really biting, that continued to bite North Korea. And now we have a different equation here at the United Nations, where China and Russia will not support further sanctions on North Korea for their continued escalation, nuclear escalation, ballistic missile escalation, etc. So, but China is a key player. So now with President Biden had a good meeting with President Xi Jinping in San Francisco during APEC, and there's a sense that we're moving closer together. It makes perfect sense. Our economies are interdependent. It makes perfect sense. We have common objectives. It's not only climate change and fentanyl and counter narcotics. It's the Korean Peninsula. It's peace on the Korean Peninsula. It's bringing North Korea back into the fold and doing something. So are we doing enough? My question is this: are we doing enough to get China to be even more proactive with North Korea, to get North Korea to come back to negotiations, not only with the United States, but maybe reconstituting the six-party talks or something, of being creative? And as you correctly indicated, there's certain bandwidth that, with the war Ukraine and what's happening in Gaza with Israel's war against the terrorist group Hamas. There's so much can be done, but there's so much going on here on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea, but certainly with Myanmar, and I talked about that briefly, what's happening in Iran and Tehran and so forth, and what's happening in Africa. We can go down the whole list of things. But this is, we need to be a leader, to be a superpower. We need to be engaged in all of the above, and the world looks to the United States for all of the above. So I guess my very brief question is, are we doing enough to get China to be more proactive, to get North Korea to come back to negotiations so that we can try to resolve some of those issues on the Korean Peninsula that's going in a very negative direction?
Well, I know that in Jake Sullivan's talk with Wang Yi and so on, that and in the broader renewed dialogue with China, North Korea has been part of that discussion. The problem is that the Chinese resent it when we say, well, North Korea is your client, you can deliver them, and they resist that. And there is questions about how much leverage China actually has with North Korea. But I also think in the current geopolitical context of U.S. China great power competition, there's a sense in which anything that hurts the United States, the Chinese look favorably upon. And so to have this tension on the Korean Peninsula, I think the Chinese may be thinking that's America's problem. I don't think they're I do think they're worried about stability, and there may be some elements of cooperation possible, particularly with regard to another nuclear test from North Korea. But I think that the geopolitical tension overrides the basic self-interest where we do have overlapping interests with China on the Korean Peninsula. So I'm not sure what more we could do, because the framework is this strategic competition, and in a sense, if you look at the geoeconomic competition and technology, both sides seem to be saying, I don't care if I hurt myself if I hurt you more. That seems to be a sub-theme in both behavior of both the U.S. and China. So I'm not sure how much potential there is, although I think we ought to be continuing to talk to China about North Korea, because, as you say, at the end of the day, they just want it to be stable. They don't like instability on their borders.
Thank you, Bob. I think we're coming to the closing hour here. A very excellent discussion. Alexandre, thank you for your excellent commentary and your questions. Bob, thank you for your presentation and your response to many questions from Alexandre and myself. There's so much going on in the world, and let's be straight about it. The world is looking to the United States, certainly to the United States, to take that leadership role, and that's it's a big challenge. And I think that I want to give credit to the Biden administration. I think we are managing it, but there's always more that we can be doing, one would say, right? Because peaceful resolution to all these issues is so important. And indeed, North Korea should be a part of that equation, and it indeed is part of that equation. So, Michael, over to you, and thank you for having these sessions and discussions, and to the UPF for doing the great work you're doing.
Thank you, Ambassador DeTrani. Another fantastic program. Mr. Robert Manning, we're so encouraged to hear the facts and the current views at the highest level of analysis and understanding. And Dr. Mansourov, you always give us so much more insight. We're very grateful to the Washington Times, which covers these programs of the Washington Brief, which helps it get a very broad voice throughout the world, but especially in the ROK. Also, I want to thank the UPF for sponsoring this program and others. And we're looking forward to engagement and dialogue as we go forward, because we do believe dialogue should continue in every possible way. We do think the six-party talks had a tremendous effect on building friendships that are ongoing today. And the efforts by the last administration and also previous administrations, they're not lost. They do go forward. And we are looking forward to this administration right now, even engaging at this late hour. And engagement will help. But I do think the next administration, if it changes from one party to the next, I think there's going to be the high priority now. The world is really shocked and very concerned about the announcements on December 31st by Kim Jong-un, and we are very concerned that this can go in a positive direction. So we thank you. We thank you to all of our Washington Brief audience, and we will be back every first Tuesday of the month at 2 p.m. Thank you.